This week, we speak with Sundar Krish from Sken.ai about what a DevOps-First approach to AppSec means for turning software scanners into effective automation. In the news segment, we look at lateral movement in cloud misconfigurations, spoofing email with a clever configuration, combating memory corruption with a compiler, clobbering compiled software with a fuzzer, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Today, cybercriminals are taking advantage of an expanded attack surface to commit malicious activities ranging from hijacking user accounts to making fraudulent purchases. Businesses need solutions that can protect their sites from this increase in fraudulent activity. reCAPTCHA Enterprise is a frictionless fraud detection service that leverages our experience from more than a decade of defending the internet with reCAPTCHA and data for our network of 4 million sites. To learn more about how reCAPTCHA can defend your website or mobile application against fraudulent activity, visit securityweekly.com/reCAPTCHA. Security threats in cloud-native environments move fast, which means that security teams need to have the same visibility into their infrastructure, network, and applications as developers and operations. With Datadog security monitoring, engineering teams can easily detect malicious activity in real time before it affects their customers. Use out-of-the-box detection rules and detailed observability data in one unified platform to investigate security attacks. See it in action by signing up for a live security demo and receive a Datadog t-shirt by visiting securityweekly.com/Datadog. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 119, recorded August 24th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Happy Smoky Monday.
Happy Smoky Monday. We also have Mr. John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, kids. How you doing?
Doing well. Glad to have you with us again. Join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcast and virtual training announcements and to receive your personal invite to our Discord server. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the list. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Sundar Krish is the CEO and co-founder of application security / DevOps startup called Sken.ai. Previously, he did another startup called Waygum, and that was venture funded and acquired. He was a distinguished architect at Cisco before that and has worked in technology in Silicon Valley for over 20 years. Hello, Sundar. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Doing well, and we're glad to have you here because we talked, and I think much of the industry has talked about DevOps, DevSecOps, SecDevOps, and all the ops in whatever order they are, and that can get a little confusing. But fundamentally, I think what everyone's trying to do is just build more secure software, and unfortunately, they're doing it with somewhat mixed success. So if we're taking these labels, and we're trying to reorder them in something that makes sense or makes it successful, what does it mean to take a DevOps-first approach to this problem, and how does that put a team on a path to more secure software?
Yeah, so there's two ways to answer this question. One from a technology point of view, and one from a market point of view. From a technology point of view, gone are the days, when we did the waterfall mode of development, where you did development for 6 months and testing for 2 months, where security didn't have any dependency on developers at DevOps. Right now, everything is agile, everything is CI/CD, right? So you need to put the security scanning automation into your CI/CD. Otherwise, there's really nothing for security to look at. And who owns a CI/CD? It's the DevOps, right? So basically, in the workflow of things, the security automation starts with DevOps. And that's why the application security tools need to have this DevOps-First view. And from a market point of view, if you see many of the market reports, they say that the DevSecOps market is expected to explode about 10 times in the next few years. And the primary reason for this explosion is the adoption of security by mid-markets. Until now, it was the large enterprises that have been interested in security, but these days, mid-markets are also cranking up a lot of apps, web and mobile apps, and they are interested a lot in security. The fundamental problem with mid-markets is that, they don't have any AppSec expertise. I mean, they might have some security people, but, most of them are doing like basic security, like, network and firewalls and stuff like that, but they don't have any application security people or team or expertise. What they do have is DevOps, because most of these mid-markets are cloud native. And as I said, the security automation starts up with DevOps, and, they don't have any application security expertise. So most of the current products out there, they need somebody with application security expertise to get started or operate. And they don't really work for, DevOps and mid-market. So what we have done is we have built Sken from the ground up, having DevOps in mind, having this DevOps-First perspective in mind. And that's totally different from, what the current tools are in the market.
Yeah, and so we talked about. I think you highlighted several important aspects there. And one is that DevOps owns that release architecture. So if they're owning the architecture, that means they're well positioned to do something about security. And that may imply they're responsible for it. But you're trying to answer that question, or you are answering that question of what should they be doing? And part of that is, here's a bunch of scanners, here's a bunch of tooling to bring in, but rather than manage the tooling, that's not really what the ultimate goal is here either, though, for even the security team. It's not about, do we have tooling available to find vulnerabilities? It's actually more of, what are the vulnerabilities and how do we fix them? So if we have that feedback loop, let's tell us a bit more about how that feedback loop of just seeing what the vulnerabilities are so the DevOps team knows to fix them looks like.
Yeah, you're right. So, I mean, if you took the responsibilities of the teams, right, the security team is more interested in what the vulnerabilities are, like how to fix them, and how risky they are, right? So that's what they want to focus their time on, right? And the DevOps team, again, they just want to put like the automation at one shot, right? They don't want to keep coming back to it. So the tool should sort of take care of all the different permutations and combinations of which scanners to use at what time, like how do you scan it and all that stuff, right? So that's kind of what we do, right? And if I may show quickly my screen, so basically from a DevOps perspective, all that they have to do is they have to do these 3 steps, right? So the first step is all that they have to do is copy paste this piece of code into their CI/CD or Jenkins or Travis or what they have, right? And they just have to write a small settings file for an application, and that's pretty much it. At runtime, we, based on the application's language and the architecture, we automatically figure out, which scanners are needed, right, across all categories of scanners. There's SAS scanners, DAS scanners, SCA scanners, and all that, right? We automatically download the latest Docker image of those scanners and execute the scans in a Docker container on your CI/CD machine, right? And only the scan results are uploaded to the Sken cloud, right? And you can review them in the portal. So this way, the DevOps doesn't even need to know, what all scanners to pick, what all types of scanners to pick, how to set them up, how to maintain them, how to update them, right? Everything is done transparently by our product, right? And all that, once the DevOps put in that 2 lines of code, it basically gives them an AppSec in a box for DevOps, and, they can just forget about it. And after that, it's basically the developers or the security guys, who can come in and, review the findings, right? And we do a lot of noise reduction there as well. So again, going by the fact that, you don't really need a lot of app security expertise, right? So we do a lot of correlations between all the scans. So it makes it really simple for people without app security expertise to sort of understand what's going on here.
So Sundar, tell us a little more.
Oh, go ahead, John.
Sorry if I may jump in. Tell us a little more about that part. Generating scan results. Well, yeah, there's a lot of value in setting these tools up and figuring out which needs to be run against, what source code types you've detected. But tell me a little more about how are you filtering? How are you not just, if you run 5 of those tools that someone who's never seen this output before, they're going to have a bad day. So how do you sort of filter that and make that manageable for them?
So, so when you say we run 5 of those tools, right? What we do is that, based on, let me explain that part a little bit.
I'm guessing, but go ahead.
Yeah, and your guess is good. So basically, what we do is, we look at the application's language and architecture, right? For example, let's say if it's Java, right? We say, okay, you need to use find segbuts for that. If it's if it's Python, we invoke the bandit scanner, right? And we look at source code, we do the SCA scanning as well, which looks for open source libraries using, OAuth dependency check. If you put in a URL of an application, right, then we know that, we got to do the DAS scanning. So, we use OAuth ZAP for that. So basically, based on the current status of the application, the language and the architecture, we automatically figure out what scans you want, right? So you're right. At the end of the day, if it's a running application, you might run like 5 or 6 different types of scans, including, SAS scans, DAS scans, SCA scans, secrets, license, containers, APIs, and so on, right? Now, what happens on the front end is obviously all the results of all these scanners, basically come to our cloud, right? And you have this portal where you can view all the results, right? So one of the things, and obviously, every scanner out there, they do a lot of noise reduction using machine learning, right? So just to be honest with you, right? But the unique advantage that we have is that, we're able to correlate across these multiple scanners, right? And reduce the noise by a lot more degree. Just to give you an example, right? It's a very simplistic example. Let's say you've done the source code scanning, right? And it looks at a piece of code and it says, hey, this piece of code has 10 critical issues, right? Now you do a DAS scanning, which is basically, scanning the application from a runtime perspective, right? And then you figure out, hey, this piece of code really never gets called, right? So those 10 critical issues are not critical anymore, right? So we can sort of, do a lot of these correlations across these multiple types of scanning, which basically reduces, the noise, sometimes as much as 80%, right? This is something that a lot of other tools don't do because most of these tools are like, individual scanners, they do only one type of scanning and that's all they look at. So what we, use open source scanners behind the scenes, right? And, there are open source scanners spread across all these categories. So we're able to come with all these security vulnerabilities across these categories, and we're able to correlate them, right? And that correlation brings down the noise a lot. And when the user views it, it's not like every different finding is going to look different, right? We actually normalize it, right? And aggregate it. And so the user, it just looks like a security issue, which is really, noise filtered by a great degree.
Cool.
Yeah, I think what a lot of it sounds like is for as much to sort of build up a parallel to what we've seen with cloud is that, clouds and infrastructure as code, they've abstracted into code a lot of what the infrastructure network topologies, service to, or system to system communications look like. It's like this is an approach that's kind of abstracting AppSec scanners into a much simpler basically a much simpler approach that rather than saying, yes, developers, DevOps team, you're responsible for security, here's the list of all the scanners to go run and manage, rather than having to take on the management of all of those, it's more of, here's the 2-line, Travis or whatever, Jenkins, CI/CD deployment change that you can make that will pull in these containers and then drop in contextually that, like you said, this is the one for Java, here's over here for Python. And so it sounds like too, it's not actually even increasing the burden because you're bringing the scanners to where the code is as well. So, the code doesn't actually have to leave the premises. It also, you're just using resources, it sounds like, that are already part of the build process. So it's not like there's actually, you may be spinning up extra containers, but you're doing that in where developers are already their infrastructure. So all that sounds quite appealing from that DevOps-First style. I think that to continue on that question that John was bringing up, you were also talking about here's what the normalization looks like to help with prioritization. I'm kind of curious too, how have you seen, I guess the audience here is obviously DevOps, but how have you seen them react to this or respond to this in either changing their code quality or generating metrics out of this, or just being able to pull in security as something that's part of their process from that people perspective, or even just how their feedback loop perspective?
Well, I mean, so on the first point, you're absolutely right. I mean, just like, infrastructure as a code, right, or infrastructure as a service, we sort of abstract the entire security, right, sort of give AppSec as a service, if you will, right? Maybe we should come up with a better name, but that's kind of what we do, right? And so the second question, so as I said, it's the DevOps, right, that sort of like put this two piece of code, and most of their job is done with that, right? And the next thing that they do is, like there are some settings on the app that they can do, right? Which if the, I mean, these are all optional settings, but if you do the settings, the noise reduction becomes even more better, right? But once you do that, right, it's usually up to the developers. The developers can come and look at the list of issues, and let's say they have no idea about security at all, right? The easiest thing that we have seen them do is they just look at our calculated risk scoring, which could go from low to critical, right? Some of them just take the critical ones and they work on that, right? Critical ones usually are like, let's say 10% of their entire list of issues, right? That's one of the paths that we have seen developers who don't have much app security knowledge, right, do, right? I mean, they just take the critical issues and then they go and put the copy paste the issue on the Google, and they get some they get some solution for that, and they do that after that, right? So that's one way. And people with a little bit of app security knowledge, right? I mean, we have, our portal does give them ways to filter and sort the issues, based on different categories of issues and so on. So they go a little bit deep, right? And some people, they might have some security people as well who will help in sorting this out even a little bit further, right? But as I said, right at the surface, we are making sure that what we present to the user is something that they can consume without a lot of application security expertise.
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned too, so a lot of this are tools that organizations could have been running, right? Because these are open source tools. You mentioned a couple from OWASP and so on, but they're clearly not. So maybe, tell us a bit more about, there was this focus on mid-market. And I also appreciated the fact that you said that, these particular organizations, these size, just don't have an AppSec team. It's not so much that developers don't know security or don't care about security. I think that's a bit of a, that's the 90s or early 2000s way of thinking. It's more, it's got to be something else if these tools here, if these open source tools exist, and that's what you're addressing here. So how have you seen, better adoption from this type of approach versus us just saying on an episode like this, go download this particular OWASP tool and run it in your CI/CD pipeline?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, before we started doing Sken, we talked to about, 250 plus, mid-market customers. Now, the first problem, as I said, is, a lot of the commercial software AppSec scanners out there, they are very expensive, right, out of the budget of these mid-market customers, and they also need like AppSec expertise to even get started, right? So that's something that the mid-market customers don't have. On the other hand, you have these open source tools, which are free, obviously, right? And a lot of the mid-market customers that we have talked to, at some point of time, they've all played around, they've all started, using these open source tools, right? The problem is that, after a while, they give it up, right? The reason is that, most of these open source tools, first of all, there are like 50 plus open source tools out there across all these, different categories of application security testing, right? So the first challenge is to like figure out, okay, what tool, do I use for what, right? So that's number one. And how do we configure them for my very specific situation, right? And the next thing is, every tool gets set up in a different way, right? Every tool has to be managed. Their lifecycle has to be managed in a very different way. And, they have to be updated in a very different way, right? The third thing is, every tool outputs their results also in a very different way. One tool, gives a JSON, one tool gives an XML, right? And the fourth thing is, the risk rating or the way, the tools sort of like talk about security, it's not normalized across the tools, right? So there's always kind of another layer like required on top of that, where you need to aggregate all the issues, normalize them, right? Normalize the risk scoring and, figure out how you want to tackle that, right? And I've seen people use all kinds of ways, starting with Excel sheets to something more complex, right? So there's a lot of maintenance and a management nightmare on top of that. That's why, over time, they stop using these open source to school scans, right? Again, what we are doing in sense is, we are taking something that's affordable and unmanageable, right, which is open source scanners, and making them affordable, but also manageable, right? So, this is not very new. Red Hat had done the same thing to Linux, or more recently, Cloudera or Elastic have done the same thing to their open source counterparts, right? Where they took an open source, which is quite affordable, which is quite good at what it's doing at its core, right? But it was not manageable, so they added a management layer on top of that, right? So that's kind of what we do, except that we do it across 50 plus open source scanners, and we add what's called a SaaS management layer on top of them to make it really more manageable.
So then that also too then, so if I am, a DevOps team coming into this with appreciating security, but without the expertise, and I hear, 50 different scanners, and maybe I've listened to some Application Security Weekly, and I've heard about software composition analysis, SaaS, DAS, like you've mentioned, container security. How can I get a good sense that these scanners are giving me coverage of different areas of my code? And even for that matter, the also important questions, what's it not looking at that I might need to engage in AppSec team or just add some extra scrutiny to?
Yeah, first of all, to take a step back, I think you mentioned SaaS, DAST, and SCA, right? I think some of your viewers might know about all these categories, but a lot of DevOps and mid markets that we talk to, right? Just mentioning that there are these 10 different types of scans, just gives their head a spin, right? So that's the first problem that we are solving, right? Hey, we're saying, hey, you don't even need to know about all these 10 different types of scanners,
but they're
right?
Acronyms. Acronyms are fun. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, so that's kind of the first thing that we're solving, right? So you don't even need to know about all these different types of scanners. All that you do is put those 2 lines of code in your CI/CD, and you're good to go, right? And again, the problem with security is that, again, going back to like the place, where they were using open source, right? Even when they were using open source, they were not doing it across all the categories. They might use a SaaS scanner, but they don't use like, SCA scanners or DAS scanners or other things. The problem with security is that, it's only as good as the weakest link, right? You might have the best source code scanning done as possible, right? But if you don't do anything else, you're kind of like leaving a gaping hole in terms of security. And that's, again, not something that a lot of DevOps people are not aware of, right? And so when we say that, hey, this is we make sure that it's a holistic security. It's not just secured from one point of view, right? But it's secured from all points of view, right? Points of view which you didn't even know existed in the first place. That's a huge positive for them.
Yeah,
Sundar, sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sundar, I have a question on the open source scanners, right? We know there's a lot of them out there. How do they compare, though, to some of the commercial scanners? Where are there gaps in the coverage of some of these open source scanners? Is there value in potentially integrating a commercial scanner into what you guys offer? I'm just curious, kind of that quality between the open source and the commercial tools.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you see some of the open source scanners, right? At the core of what they do, just the scanning alone, actually, some of them are even better than commercial scanners, right? And the reason is that most of those open source scanners are very specialized. You have open source scanners for every specific language, right? So there is a specific open source scanner for Java, for Python, and all that. Whereas if you look at commercial scanners, it's one scanner that somehow magically does all languages and all architectures, right? In the open source world, people write very, very, specific and specialized scanners for each language and architecture and so on, right? So that sort of gives an open source scanners a bit of an edge, right? So in what they do, just in terms of core scanning, hardcore scanning, right, they do a very good job, right? But as I said, what they are not good at is all the setup and the maintenance and everything that goes on top of it, right? Which is where commercial scanners, do a lot of good job, right? As I said, at the core of it, maybe, it's kind of almost the same, but commercial scanners, do help enterprises, they have a lot of enterprise workflows and all that stuff. So they do that good job. So what we are doing is, basically taking these open source scanners and sort of adding that layer, right? Management layer. So they are even better than some of the commercial scanners out there, right? And with regards to the second question, right? Are we going to, integrate into commercial scanners? I don't think so, right? Because that's a different problem to solve for a different set of market, right? Again, since we are focusing on mid markets, most of these mid markets don't use any commercial scanners right now. So on the scale of application security, right? Let's say from 0 to 10, they are somewhere in 0 to 2, right? So we are trying to take them from 0 to 2 all the way to 8. right? Whereas, if you focus on commercial scanners, right, that's typically used by large enterprises, which are kind of like already at the level of 8 or so, right? So that's not the market segment that we are trying to get in, right? So at this point, I would say that, it's not on our roadmap to integrate with some of the commercial scanners, right?
I'm glad you can get the same level
yeah.
of quality out of the open source, right? I mean, that's always the big question.
Yeah, as I said, open source at the raw scanning capability, right? Open source scanners are actually much better than some of the commercial counterparts, right? And once you add the manageability layer, which is where the open source was lacking, right? It actually becomes much better than the commercial scanners in some instances, right? Obviously, there are a lot of instances where commercial scanners, the highly priced ones, for example, they're pretty deep, and and so on. But again, we are looking for mid markets, right, where we are trying to take them from nothing in security to to the best of what they can offer in security.
As you've been talking about this, one of the underlying themes you I think that's coming back to is that these are mid-market engineering teams, DevOps teams, and they do have constrained resources, both in just budget, because as you're talking, maybe they don't have budget for commercial tools. Even if open source is free, there's also engineering time required to maintain them. And you're abstracting a lot of that away, which sounds very appealing to save that portion of the engineering budget. But the scanners still have to execute. So there's also, from a DevOps team's perspective, what can they sort of expect, or what should they be expecting when they start to drop in up to 50 scanners onto their release pipeline in terms of additional resources that's going to do? Because even if spinning up nodes can be expensive just from within clouds, or just the time. So what's something else that they can look at, or how should they think of approaching that?
So, I mean, if you're just talking purely in terms of computing costs, right? Yes, I mean, our scanners actually run on the CI/CD machine of the DevOps, right? And that's a model which works actually both ways for us as well as the clients, right? For us, it works, because it doesn't increase our cloud computing costs, right? And that's why we are able to give at a freemium model, actually 1,000 app scans per month, which is nothing close to what the industry offers right now. From the client side, obviously their code, doesn't come all the way to our servers, right? Which is something that a lot of clients are sensitive about, right? So obviously there is a little bit of extra computing cost on the client side, right? But again, in these days, where the computing costs are really, really low, right? That's not something that a lot of clients are complaining about, right? And also purely from a CI/CD perspective, right? There are, every CI/CD, including Jenkins and Travis, there are ways to control these things, right? So you can make the scans actually run even on a different machine. Jenkins, for example, supports a distributed architecture, right? So it doesn't really have to run on the same CI/CD machine. It can actually run on another machine, and Jenkins can still manage it, and it can be non-blocking, right? So it doesn't really block your builds. So there are ways, where you can actually push this out to another server, right? Which can contain your costs, and it's non-blocking. It doesn't block your bills and so on. So a lot of clients, are doing something like that, right, to make sure that they're able to at least see what the computing costs are, and they were all pleasantly surprised that the costs are not really that high at all.
Hey, Sundar, question. At least squeeze my nose in as usual, Mike. So one of the patterns we've been seeing from some of the container security vendors out there is a lot of hand waving about, oh my God, you can't just download a container image from the internet and run it. So question there is, are you sensing from the mid-market that they're concerned about that, or have you put some sort of checks and balances into the product before it starts downloading some of those scanners, or any thoughts around that?
You mean downloading any container images? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Haven't really heard specifically anything about that. So we use, Clara and Claire, which are open source scanners for containers, right? And containers in some sense, it's just like scanning dependencies, right? You're just scanning a bunch of other dependencies and third-party software that you're including in your application. Well, I haven't seen anything specific to what you just mentioned. they run just as fine as any other scanners.
And it might just be a concern with some of the how would I say, a marketing driven concern, but okay, just curious.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Yeah, I think to go back, thanks, John. And where I was going to go to on a bit of the containerization, but more about the deployment pipeline, is that it does sound like, since this is, as we saw in the quick screenshot, basically add 2 lines. Here's a pip file, 2 lines to enter. And where was I going? Oh, it's predictable. So your build environment, either when you launch builds or the number of builds you're launching per day or per week, is somewhat predictable. So I think that does lean into this aspect of what is the overhead of bringing in scanners, both in terms of engineering resources to manage them, hopefully very minimal due to this type of orchestration of these, as well as the time for them to execute, but also too just how many resources they consume. So all of that is basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is, predictability always seems like an appealing thing from an engineering perspective, because you can start to model it and make predictions on it, as the word implies, and then use those feedback loops to go and improve things over time.
Yeah, and it's not just predictable from the infrastructure or the resourcing point of view, right? Even from the pricing point of view, right? It gets predictable pretty soon. Our pricing is, basically we offer like 1,000 free app scans a month, right? For an organization, which is, as I said, the next best thing out in the market is something like 200 scans per lifetime, right? So we offer 1,000 app scans per month, which is of like 10x order of what's out there, right? And after that, it's $1 per app scan, right? But even though it's kind of like you pay by use pricing, right? Clients are able to predict that pricing very soon, because they have a certain number of apps, and the apps sort of like follow a certain number of scan patterns. So pretty soon, they're able to come up with how much they're going to be spending, right? And and based on that, sometimes we also have like enterprise level deals, right, and negotiations and so on. But yeah, it adds a layer of predictability on resources, and orchestration, right? Resources both on infrastructure as well as people resources, and pricing as well.
Cool. And then, going back to ultimately what the purpose of this, or a goal, the motivation here is to build more secure applications. I'm curious if you have any parting thoughts, parting suggestions on how DevOps teams can focus on the findings that come out of tools like this and make smart decisions on either the prioritization, ways of avoiding a whack-a-mole for yet another cross-site scripting or yet another vuln or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so, again, what we are trying to do is something, we think that the application security scanner market, right, has been sort of like focused purely on large enterprises so far, right? And we're sort of trying to change that model, sort of like in some ways radically, right, by introducing a very cheaper alternative, right, affordable alternative, and an alternative which requires very less application security expertise, right? And again, to that end, right, I think, and a lot of DevOps that we talk to, they want to get into security, right? They want to get into this DevSecOps role, that's sort of an aspirational role, right? So some of them really want to get a lot more than just putting in those 2 lines of code, right? Once they start using this tool, they want to understand what's going on, right? They want to look at the security side of things as well, right? And for some of that, again, we, there's a lot more controls that they can do, as I said, to make this security calculation much better, right? Again, all of these things it doesn't require security expertise. It's all the DevOps knowledge of the application that they already have. But still, they can sort of understand the correlation between, hey, if I do things this way, if I put this setting, right, that sort of helps me, secure the app in this way, right? I think that's something that sort of ultimately they come to know, and I think that's good.
No, that does sound good. And it sounds like a good, making that calculation to make software more secure always hopefully balances out. I'm not sure what the best metaphor is there, but I want to say thank you, Sundar, for bringing us about Sken.ai and joining us for this chat.
Yeah, thank you. And, you can go to Sken.ai and you can sign up for free. And as I said, it's free for the first 1,000 scans a month. So I call the super freemium model. So I hope all of you go to Sken.ai and sign up for free. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's about 3 blog posts that are on the site as well that give a really flesh out a lot of what we've been talking about here too. So I encourage everyone to go check those out too. So thanks again, Sundar. Also want to say thanks to Matt and John for once again joining us. I want to thank all of you. We're going to take a quick break and we'll return with news of the week.